And I think we should maybe start with this, as in what your thoughts are about where is the biggest gap of what we as scientists can measure, and we can show data, but what is actually needed to change behavior within a city, or how do we create policies in a city? I don't know. I'm going to start, sorry ladies, with René Hestermann, because he is representing the city of Zurich. So maybe you are in a unique position in this room right now to tell us your thoughts. What can you do with the data? Where does it should go? What do you need from the scientists to make something happen in Zurich?
Thank you. Yeah, hello. What we don't know, we cannot manage, or we do not manage. So it's all about the data we need as a decision base for the measurements. And as a director in the administration, preparing the decisions of the politicians in Zurich, it's our duty to give relevance and give options to the decision makers, where they have to act and how they can act to become net zero at the end. And yeah, what we need from scientists at the end is not the end of pipe measurement of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. What I need for the reports and the decision preparation is the sources of the emissions, the responsibles for the emissions. We have to deliver the reports, the monitorings according the relevance, the responsibility of the emitters. So who are the emitters of the greenhouse gas emissions in Zurich? We know it's mobility, we know it's buildings, the heatings, the direct emissions in town. Agriculture, it's not. It's 0.0, almost nothing. So we don't have to implement a city agricultural policy for net zero. We have 800 hectares, but it's not the major field of activity for politicians. But yeah, the mobility in town and the heating systems. We know that we have 20,000 fossil driven heating systems in town, and they have to be transformed. And then how they have to be transformed. This they want to, and how much it costs, they want to know. And which frameworks, which instruments do we set in place to make it happen until 2040?
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to Christine Kern now, because you talked about projectification this morning a little bit. And well, I mean, you are in the administration, but still this goes a little bit into political cycles to present something, to make decisions. So does that fit well? Do you think this is useful, like this approach? And I mean, yeah, it is a little bit. So can you, in your position, basically provide something overstepping these project cycles? And do you think this has happened? You're coming more from the German-based cities.
You can give it a try. I think Zurich is in a pretty good position. I mean, I've done some work also in Swiss city, and Swiss cities, and they're in a better position than cities in other parts of Europe. Let's put it this way. So would also have some questions, of course, but in case you don't have the own capacities to generate the data, what would be your recommendation actually? And especially when it comes to smaller cities, I mean, it's also about the scaling issue, or you can also call it transfer. What can they actually do if they are not in the same position than Zurich is? That's one thing. And then there's this question also of election cycles. And that's important, of course, because climate change policy is a long-term development. You cannot solve that in 4 years. That's also a question, but can you really do that policymakers stay to the goal of climate neutrality? Is that fixed or will it be changed? What can you do in, let's say, also in interim period? So projectification is more related to really projects. Yeah? So even your project will run out at a certain point.
I meant the cycle, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's the same. This temporal dimension is also important for policy making, of course. And what can you do with this long-term policy? Can you fix it? So do you fix interim goals, and what happens if you don't reach the goal? So things like that. But you cannot say, okay, we want to be climate neutral in 2040. What happens in between? Because you will have elections.
Well, perhaps I'm just for 3 years now at the City of Zurich in the public administration. Before, I've been for 12 years or more, 14 years in, always in the private sector, before then in the waste sector, at my climate and at South Pole for the voluntary engagements. And what I see is voluntary activities are not enough. Of course, we don't solve a problem with front runners, with pioneers only. For solving these net zero targets, we need compliance, obligations from everybody. And this changed with these climate movements. And so I think we have nowadays this majority commitment all over to do the transformation entirely. But of course, not to implement then any type of measurements. There are several instruments, measurements, or sectors where it's difficult. Mobility, for example, in cities. Take away the parking slots, we're transforming streets towards cycle areas. And that's difficult, very emotional. And even in a city where, like Zurich, where we have public quotations for climate protection activities, when it goes for credit for district heating or credit for incineration facility or whatever, then we always have 70, 80, 85% pro votations. But if it comes to take away the parking, then we have a lot of how do you say? Resistance, yeah, of course. But how do we go for it? I think this target, the net zero target, the climate neutrality target in itself is such a strong target. We have to decarbonize. And I think in major parts of the public, of the economy as well, it's understood. It goes in this direction. And at the end, it's always then on the level of the specific instruments, of the specific steps that have to be done, where we have for a few months, for perhaps a few years, some resistance. Imagine in Switzerland, we took, I think, 4 or 5 times a votation that women could vote. It was in 71. I still remember first votation, and I could go with my mother to votation. It's not a long time ago. And this had to happen, 4 or 5 times. It was always refused. So sometimes it needs twice, 3 times, 4 times an effort that a step can be made. And perhaps in the mobility sector, it's a difficult one. There we have to take 2, 3 times. I say always in Swiss language, nicht loklockwit, don't give up. Just try another one. It needs sometimes time, another sleep, another year, another argumentation from another point of view, and then it will happen. It will happen the right things that has to happen, I think. So don't give up in the small cities.
But I would like to take up one thing you said, to try again and again. I can only agree, because that's how change happens over time. However, we had in the discussion previous in our workshop to our online people, well, and people who have not been in the workshop here live. There was one part, Miranda, you brought up that, well, if we overshoot in time certain goals we have set ourselves, like the 1.5 degree from Paris, and that people then get like fed up basically, and that could in theory happen in those we try again and again and again, but at some point we are too late, or at least to the promises we made. So how do we tackle that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I raised that point simply because I think we have to be a little careful how we communicate. Having a 1.5 degree target was used to start action 10, 15 years ago. And now we're getting very close to that 1.5 degree target, and it's looking pretty challenging. And I think we have to be very careful to also help people understand that it's a target and we've missed it, and we're paying a price for missing it, or we will be missing it. But we need to do everything possible to keep the rising temperatures as low as possible, because with each small increment of higher temperature, the impacts become more costly, the human suffering becomes more visible, etc. But I wanted to bring in another point here. And I think one is that we're going to see some generational change. The young people think differently than the somewhat older people. And what I see among the students, at any rate, that I interact with on a daily basis, climate change and the whole discussion around it is very real for them. They think about it in a very different way than the somewhat older generations do. And they are also starting to make behavioral changes that are much more obvious to them, that I think are something that for older generations are not always that easy. Younger generations, yeah, public transportation, of course, bicycle, of course. The students who I said, oh, you buy your clothes at a secondhand shop, and they say no, in a vintage shop. You have to get the vocabulary right. But you can see that there is a cultural shift going on, which goes to your point about voting for women, that became a cultural change that took time, but it happened. And I just noticed that big change happened yesterday in France with the constitutionalization of the right to abortion. I mean, that's a huge cultural change that's taken a long, long time. I think what we can also think about are how new technologies may also be contributing to possibilities for us. So with artificial intelligence and digitalization, this may make all of these discussions we've been having for a decade about smart everything a little bit easier to actually make progress towards efficiency improvements that probably should have happened a long time ago, but maybe are easier to push forward now because the data will be more easily available. in the next few years. But what we also see, and this is where we maybe need to work politically, it makes a real difference if you have leadership that wants to have transition. The mayor of Paris, wow, has she managed to push through change that probably wouldn't have happened without her willingness to say climate change is a matter I care about. I'm seeing that in the university I'm working in, a new president who has decided climate change, sustainability matters, and for the first time, one of the universities that considers itself a leader university is developing a climate action plan. It's taken time, but it's happening. And that brings in this whole question of, okay, how do we take our goal of becoming a climate neutral university earlier than the city wants to be climate neutral? Well, the first thing you need to do is actually understand what are our emissions. The university had no idea. And so they're now putting together a monitoring system to understand scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions of the university, starting with scope 1, and then slowly moving towards scope 2 and scope 3. And the first thing we discover, what's the biggest problem at the university? It's that the professors fly to do their research or to go to conferences. And that, of course, then means you have to find a policy solution to address that. And the first obvious thing is to say, well, when it's possible, use a train instead of a plane. Okay, that'll happen, and it's starting to happen already. What will be harder is to say, well, maybe there's a carbon budget and you're only allowed to fly once every 2 years to a conference or something like that. And that's where you can also see the resistance, even on the part of the president, who will say, yes, but research requires X, Y, Z. So there will also be trade-offs that have to be made, but having that data is necessary, because otherwise talking about climate neutrality is just kind of guessing in the dark. Trying to understand which of the buildings at the university are the big emitters of the chemistry department. Because of the refrigeration. And then you hear a very interesting story from one of the researchers in the medicine field that said, yeah, we had new freezers put in for the laboratories, and unbeknownst to us, they set the temperature at minus 60 degrees Celsius, when it only needs to be minus 40 degrees Celsius for the lab. And that's a huge difference in terms of how much energy is being used. But when you start looking a little bit more closely and monitoring these things, you suddenly start to see, a small change here that's not going to have any negative impacts saves the university money, it's less emissions, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I'm being a professor and talking too long. Your
No,
turn.
I think I will give it to Christine. And you were saying this morning about scaling up on those different networks. So do you think like actions from the University of Munich in being carbon neutral, is it something that could work, being scaled up?
Sure, good question. I mean, many universities started even earlier to save energy because that was about money. And the same idea also applies to cities, to be a model. So that was one of these governance types we also discovered during our research already 20 years ago, so that cities wanted to be a model. And I think it's not so common anymore, because at that time we could really save money by saving energy, because okay, there's this kindergarten or the school, and half of the money goes to the municipality and half of the money the kids can save for something or have some kind of activity they couldn't have without that money. So you're creating incentives. And also, I don't know about Zurich, I would be interested, because also the city administration can become climate neutral. And some of the cities, they have this kind of target, others don't, because that's also important. As I said, there is the city as a model for for people, for I don't know, companies. So you can change a lot by this when you go in this direction. But I don't see that in all cities, so it's more an exception.
We have this target as well. Our net zero target is even on a conventional level fixed. In the city of Zurich, people voted for 75% voted for it, and the target for the administration is 5 years earlier. So we have a net zero target 40 for the whole city and 35 for the administration to be a model. And the parliament even said all what it's in your hand of the administration, set in place infrastructure services and so on, not only for the city administration, but for the people as well, has to be made at 35.
Will it work out?
Hmm?
Will it work out?
Yeah, these targets, we at the environmental department are just the dogs, all the other colleagues do the monitoring and say what works, what doesn't work, where we see has to be enforced efforts. But all the other colleagues from all the different departments, mobility department, housing department, construction department, incineration, waste management departments, energy departments, they integrated these targets in their thoughts and thinking, because the government set the net zero target as one of the 5 major city targets for next years in their city strategy. So it's a strategic major topic for the city to become carbon neutral, net zero. And as you said, it's really a top-down topic. Culture or behavior or such major transformations have to be shown and modeled from the top. If they travel, we had in autumn a visit at Copenhagen with governors. Just one governor flew, all the others traveled with train to Copenhagen. I trained to Hamburg and then Copenhagen. And the only one who couldn't work on Monday again in Zurich was the one who flew, because the delay on that Sunday, no aviation flew from Copenhagen back to Zurich, and the others came back by train in time. Exactly. Yeah. So that's very important that we go with the example of the model in front, and that we are authentic and show it's possible. Yeah.
One question, you mentioned top down and bottom up, and I think I would also be interested to hear more about that, because I would think you need some kind of a combination of centralization and decentralization, because you also need people in the different departments which are trained. So I don't know how you do that, but you need a certain group of people who can also talk to each other, and or are even employed by different units, half or something like that. Because even if you have a Lord Mayor who is in favor of climate change policy, that does not change the whole organization. So that takes a pretty long time also to have a transformation of the administration.
All the departments had to adapt their strategies according to net zero target, and they all did within 1-2 years. The purchase of the fleet, the purchase of all the fleets, of the waste collecting trucks, of the buses, of the health course, going to the elder people. So they all adapted their strategies and then their concepts they had to. And yeah, that again was from the top, from the department heads, the governors from the departments. They reach the directors. And on the organizational level, we have a structure. We have a so-called environmental cascade from the working groups, the project responsibles to the heads of sectors, and then the directors, and then there is delegation of the councillors. And within this cascade, we are managing all the projects and the decisions, and always on the level that it has to be managed.
So they can talk to each other.
Yes, yeah, they have these working groups, and we have once a year a net zero conference where we meet all together on the different levels and exchange projects that we made and the perceptions of the projects that has to be done. And that's a very euphoric meeting always, where we see, wow, we department that, the office made this. They have pitches, 2-minute pitches to show the project. 20, 30 projects are presented in a very pitches. And perhaps to, again, and we include the stakeholders. I think we have to include the bottom up, the broad public, but as well the economy. We have innovation formats like the Climaton for the researchers and the young people coming from students to within 2 days to set up their startup. Then since beginning of this year, we have a Clean Up, a financing instrument, a fund, which is funding startups and NPOs for their climate ideas. In 2 weeks, we can give the first tranche of these subsidies. And we had almost 200 applications. We have been overrun, and we see the power of people who want to deliver solutions, services to solve that. It's fantastic. So show a carrot, and there will be so many rabbits that are interested in these carrots and delivering them services. And for the data, as I invited from MasterCard as well, Jorit here, I think we don't have to be angry to include anybody as well, big data owners, like Google's, like financial card owners or distributor or data. I'm not aware about the professional words for the several deliveries there, but yeah, we have to go the way with all different solution and service providers, and then we are much more powerful if we go inclusive on an inclusive way in the approach.
So I totally agree with you. And I like what I saw just here, is this optimism that is catchy, at the end of your presentation, like, yes, I feel good. But I'm also going to throw a bit of a thorn in the room here and look at what's been happening in a number of countries where we're starting to see some pretty strong anti-climate action or opposition to the gas tax in France, or opposition to pressures from the environmental side on the agricultural industry. We see that in Germany. There's concerns about what will happen with the next European elections, and will we see a surgence of the far right. And that makes me wonder if one of the other challenges that we maybe have to address is how do we do more of this positive messaging. It can work, we can do it, it is possible, and you can also have a job in the future. As opposed to this costs too much, it's too complicated, there's too many rules, there's too many regulations, and I just don't care. Because we see that also in our societies. Maybe less in Switzerland, the way you talked almost sounded like the ideal model of Switzerland. And it probably does work better in Switzerland because you have a dialogue-based governance structure. At the same time, we do see that opposition, and maybe also kind of an angst in terms of developments that people don't understand. Artificial intelligence, what is that? It's scary. Digitalization, my privacy. So I think this is also a dimension that we somehow have to tackle if we want to move forward and really achieve our climate goals, because we really do need to bring all of society along.
Okay, just some thoughts about that. I mean, it's also related to a divide between cities and rural areas, especially when it comes to this kind of populist movement. And I think that's a huge challenge. How do you deal with rural areas which should provide food or energy or clean water or whatsoever? And to fix that, I think that's difficult. I think that's even difficult in Switzerland. Am I right? Or how would you deal with that? Because you have the bigger cities, which are Basel or Zurich, which are pretty far ahead, but you also have the mountain regions, you have the valleys and things like that.
People living in the mountains, of course, they use much more, for example, cars than people living in a city like Zurich, because we have the public transports and all the areas you can reach with the bike as well. But if the people in the mountains once drove in an electric car, they have the same emotions like the guys in the cities driving once in an electric car or in an electric truck or an electric tractor, an agriculture. They are just fascinated. So I think there is a lot of technology acceptance as well in countryside. Perhaps first some more resistance or skepticism against new technology, but let them try and then identify some major, how do you say, mindsetter or decision makers, and they are able to then give the avalanche that as well there is changing. And you see nowadays in these rural areas, even there, they construct their houses with solar installations, with new technologies, and they are buying the electric cars as well. Mm-hmm. Because the future is more comfortable. Their children are asking them, why we still based on these old technologies? And I think these developments that you mentioned, of course, we don't have this continuous development. Yeah, sometimes we have backlashes, resistances, but keep on, just go on. It will happen.
I am a little bit aware of time. I don't know how the program has changed, but I would like to see if there's any question from the online audience or here in the room, actually, to, if that's okay with you. You will be grilled, not me. But we have to check if this is working with the pickup of the microphone.
So I don't know how to answer to this question.
Speak loudly, someone
I
online.
can shout.
We have to last on. So someone online, could you tell us if you can hear our speaker from the
That
audience?
would just come up here and then.
Yeah, we can listen. Sorry.
Thank
We are in a small place.
Yeah, because
Yes, yeah. So it is it will be easier. Okay,
Yeah,
this is the speak.
yeah.
So the question is for all of you. And it's not a question, it's just an open subject, and then you react as you want. It is the city or the country level or the academic toward the private sector, industry, tertiary activity, commercial, hotels, shops, factories, what you ask to them as a role, what you expect, how you push, how they react. So just for this, I say is an open question. And again, at the country level, what do you feel? What do you feel? What is their role? What is their ambition? They are aggressive, not aggressive, reluctant, part of the game. So I prefer open questions. So you just as a witness, you say what you're feeling, if it's possible. I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Want to start?
So the private sector is obliged, of course, as well to become net zero, to transform their businesses, their processes towards decarbonized world. Is it their heating systems or whatever it is? And there we see the same as on the city level or the regional levels. We have the early movers, the front runners of companies that already do sustainable development activities since the 90s or the late 80s, and again are on the front runner side. And then we have the ones that don't do nothing. And there as well, we have the same instruments from the country government, some obligations that are fixed that they have to fulfill. In Switzerland, for example, we have a national target net zero 2050, and the big companies have to become net zero as well until 2050 and to set in place their reduction plans until then. So they are even obliged to contribute to that.
The big companies are under the EU ETS anyway, so energy utilities or whatever, and then it's also a national decision what you do with your utilities or your energy production. But at the city level, I would say it's also important to involve stakeholders, and many cities do that, of course. So you have climate council, climate boards. Some of them are just experts, so scientists, but many of them are actually stakeholder based, and that seems to help. The other thing is that you can also have talked about this climate city contracts this morning, but you can also have contracts with companies, so smaller companies which are not under the EU ETS or so that you can really negotiate and say, okay, they also want to be climate neutral and can use that for improve their reputation in the city or sell more products or something like that. So there are also instruments to have incentives for companies.
And it's something that's starting to happen globally. We call it the race to the top, as opposed to the race to the bottom. And the race to the top is the idea that, especially the globally trading companies are in competition with each other to make it into the next industrial era. So everybody is investing, all the big companies are investing in new technological options. At the same time, they may be hesitating to make the complete transition because they're watching what everybody else is doing. So I see that in the automobile industry, for example. There's quite a lot going on with electric mobility research, and yet the big companies haven't yet made that complete transition. They're still waiting to look over the shoulder and see what the other companies are doing. Because once you make the jump, it's a huge risk factor, I think, for them. So we do see this pushing and breaking going on. But something that's changed on the regulatory front very recently is the growing number of countries that are establishing regulations that are pushing green industrial design and planning. So the European Green Deal of 2019, which was a reaction in some ways to the need to push forward on climate change as an area for European industry to lead. The US reacting to that and reacting to China with the US Inflation Reduction Act and US Infrastructure Act combined. At the time, they were said to be the largest climate policies ever passed anywhere. Europe responding to that with the European Green Industrial Plan, China coming out with its own policies. So in a sense, what I think is happening on the regulatory front is an effort to create a framework that will support the development of clean industries and clean technologies. But there's still quite a lot that needs to happen. The entire banking and financial institutions, which in many ways determine an awful lot of what happens. Where do you invest? Where do stock holders put their money? Until now, this industry has been pretty much left to its own interests. And now, slowly, the whole idea that the financial sector also needs to work in the direction of pursuing green investment, climate-friendly investment, not investing anymore in coal-fired power plants or in coal mining or in any kind of industry that's going to lead to large methane emissions, etc. This transition is very slowly beginning, but I think it will pick up speed again too. But we also see some industries that are very, very nervous. And I think that will be one of the big challenges for Europe this next decade, to make this transition, to keep pushing and saying we want to be those clean technology leaders, which is everything from the science to the actual production of equipment. Because if we lose that will, then we also lose the next industrial revolution. I actually think it's a very, very critical moment in time for Europe's future. If the politicians and the public is willing to say, we want to be the leaders and we want to make this change and we're going to be the leaders, then I think Europe will have an industrial future. If we slow down, then I think Europe will lose, because unlike other regions, Europe is too dependent on imports for just about everything. And so being the technology savvy, science savvy region is, I think, the best option for Europe, also for the long run.
I agree that for many years there wasn't a lot of industry policy in the Western world for green tech. It was just in China and India. But I think what we have to take care of is that we still keep an open access for everybody, and that we don't raise our borders for innovations and good products within this new appealing industrial policy. Otherwise, we have fantastic Chinese products where we became late runners and not front runners anymore. E-mobility, and it's better to run some Chinese cars in Europe for a good price than too expensive European cars that don't fulfill the expectations of the people. So there, I think we have to take care and to stay open, to stay global. We have to solve as a global society this problem. But that's, I think, a bit danger in these new rising industrial policies that realize again walls.
I just want to quickly react and say I'm not calling for protectionism by doing that.
Yeah.
It's a healthy, clean competition.
Yes.
As long as it does need to be happening on a fair trade basis, global
Yes.
basis. But fair trade with sustainability deeply embedded into it.
Yeah.
And what's good about it is that we're seeing everybody pushing everybody else to improve the policy framework for introducing renewable energy or for enhancing energy efficiency. But you're right, the danger of a nationalistic approach is big, and we have to be careful that that's not the direction it goes into.
Yes.
Of course, also a problem nowadays, talk about the solar panel in Germany, and now they are going to Switzerland. So the production at least leaves Germany, and Germany was leading in this area. So the times have changed. I'm also a bit skeptical now about the European Green Deal, because that's also going in maybe in the wrong direction. So we also should try to change that again, so that it's really focused also on the transformation of industry or transformation of society. But right now we talk about Ukraine and new weapons and things like that. So I'm more skeptical. I'm not sure about the US, whether that will work out. And
Depends who's the next president.
Okay, before we veer off more, there is one question from Edith.
Yes.
Do you mind coming to the microphone, please?
Well, because I have Zoom open here, I can. No problem. Sure.
Sorry.
No problem. Hi. Okay, camera, right.
No, microphone, not about the camera, but yes.
Yeah, right, okay. So thank you, all of you, but I would like to maybe challenge us a little bit and ask the question of what could be even a bigger question, more systemic thinking in order to make the shift to keeping temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. Just to give an example, Miranda, you talked about how companies are investing in new technologies, and you mentioned about electric vehicles, but we know that electric vehicles is not really transformative. It's a transitionary, but short-term transitionary solution. It's not even changing the emission situation if the energy mix of the, of the countries that they're deployed is fossil fuel based. And these new technologies, also considering AI, actually creates this amazing window of opportunity for us to imagine completely different mobility systems. So what we are seeing now is, because automotive companies are, they're incumbent, but they're strong actors, and they are lobbying, and so the policies are being made to support them, and to support them to continue doing what they have been doing, which is essentially continuing to produce cars, albeit, you know, electrical cars. And while this is happening, we are also seeing that niche innovators in mobility systems that are producing these seamless solutions, systemic solutions, are being deprived of investment, deprived of policy support, and they just, you know, they cannot continue the work of transforming the system. So my question is, what could we do to push policymakers even more, so that, you know, we are going to have policies that are that are also going to create systemic impact? How can we link climate policy with innovation policy, and how can we create incentives so that the lobbying power of the incumbents, you know, is not going to be the main influencer for policymaking, but also the niche innovators who has the potential to transform systems can get a fair share of investment and subsidies and everything. Thanks.
Maybe I can start the conversation here and say you're absolutely right. Incumbents often are barriers to change, or they slow down change, but very often they can't stop even deep transformations. Think of how many industries of the past actually have disappeared. And I don't know that the automobile is going to disappear, but I do think that the role of the automobile will change, and that the role of public transportation will change, partly because with growing urbanization and population density in many cities, having an automobile is no longer actually all that attractive. It becomes less and less attractive with time, and maybe also more and more expensive with time. So we're starting to see a growing number of cities that are either transforming the city as a whole, or districts within a city, to the carless or to the car limited kind of city. At the same time, there's still obviously not enough investment going into the transportations that are public. And there are still a lot of limitations. The train from Switzerland to Copenhagen, yes, but we were talking the other day about, well, what happens when you want to go to Bucharest? West-east travel by train is not so easy in Europe, and there are many parts of the world where it's not even an option. We often put the blame on the politicians. I actually think we also need to put the blame on ourselves as the public to pressure the politicians, because we're the consumers, and in a sense also need to indicate the kinds of changes we want and need. But I think we're starting to see some very, very exciting new models. Copenhagen, where you have elevated bridges for bicycle transportation. Cool. Singapore, where they're redesigning the concept of a city, where all buildings are now required to, I forget the percentage, but have 10% or something green built into the skyscraper, where they now have above ground, let's call it story 3 or 4 walkways connecting high rises that are planted with green trees, so that the whole idea of what a city looks like is beginning to change, and that changes the transportation options too. The idea that parking spaces should be taken away and turned into restaurant spaces took off during COVID, right? Cities around the world started to say, like, why are we letting this car sit here unmoved for weeks at a time when actually restaurants could make money using that parking space? So I do think we're starting to see some shift in thinking that is putting pressure on decision makers to think about deeper transformative change. But I am skeptical that we'll ever get rid of the automobile because it still plays a fairly important role for some people in some sectors. And when the ambulance is needed, you want the ambulance. So there will be limitations to complete transition.
We need automobiles as part of a mobility system, but we don't need the individually owned car modality dominating mobility systems.
I mean, I would also fully agree when it comes to electric cars, and what's also a problem is the cars become bigger and bigger. So, and then you need more and more energy to produce also an electric car. That's a problem. But even when you look at these huge Teslas, I think when Tesla decided to have a new factory in Brandenburg, which is pretty close to my institute, by the way, doing research on that. I mean, that had an impact on the German car makers. I think otherwise they wouldn't have changed their strategies. So that at least here you see some changes. It's very slowly, and I think they slept for decades probably. But now they are more awake of that, and still at the EU level, that's a problem. Okay, the other thing is, why do people really buy these huge cars? Why do they need them? So it's also about the consumers. So how do you change that behavior? I mean, in Copenhagen, they also had this strategy that they said, okay, people have to stand in a traffic jam, otherwise they will not change their behavior. And I think that's something you can decide, or at least in some countries, you can have some decisions at the local level and say, okay, I don't care about people sitting in their cars forever. The tram has to be faster. So if there is somebody sitting in a car in a traffic jam and the tram passes by, then they start thinking about it.
I agree with you that we really have to do some systemic change and focus on such systemic change that it's not too difficult and too complicated to behave for the individuals. That's why infrastructure, technology, innovation, regulation are important frameworks that has to be developed and set. I totally not agree with the e-mobility. Of course, the cars still in town of Zurich are too numerous. We have too many cars, and we have in Zurich 25% of our traffic mix is individual cars only, but we're gonna have in future years only 15%. So we're gonna have 85% public, pedestrian and bicycles. In the cities, it's not the instrument how to move, but as well in cities, in some cases and for some professionals and for some behaviors, it's okay. And then it's at the moment the best decarbonized individual car that we have. And in rural areas, we have these rural areas as well. And there to set in place for not very intensively
Densely populated.
dense populated areas. There sometimes it's much more efficient to use a car. And to give you an example, in Switzerland, the biggest car dealer has become the biggest solar company as well. They purchased different solar companies and they do huge installations in solar. And they will become, because of the batteries of the cars, as well as storage of electricity. And they will become a major dealer as well of renewable solar energy in the markets. This they do. So there as well are the front runners who see the chances of a risk or of a crisis and develop their business models, differentiate the business models. And there are the others that resist and don't develop. In the tourism, I've always a good example. Mountain Riggy, there was the first cable car, end of 19th century. The company who wanted to construct this first cable car at Lake Lucerne to Riggy went to Vegis village nearby and said they want to construct this new cable car, first in the world. They resisted and said, our porters bringing people up to the mountains with their horses will lose their jobs. You know what the company made? They went to the next village, Pitznau, constructed their cable car. People from Vegis lost their jobs anyway and didn't have business, nothing, no tourists. So the developments will happen anyway. If you don't adapt, if you don't see the chances, you will lose your job anyway. So the car producer who don't adapt, they will lose their business jobs anyway if they don't transform and integrate other businesses in their businesses. And it will develop.
So, well, thank you very much. I think we have overshot already a little bit. It was a really, really interesting discussion. I thought we have been not on point always, but I think this is exactly what we need as a discussion here, because for me, one of the biggest takeaways really is that, well, we have to have a multi-stakeholder approach. There is no doubt. And I think what is often a little bit forgotten is, as you pointed out, Miranda, that generation sitting here, we should just listen to the youngsters, as in how we can actually transform, you know, how we can change the behavior, because we can talk about it all day long. If people do not adapt, well, it doesn't help really.